and welcome to the subcommittee for what will be our last fully remote hearing. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody, and our April hearing will be not fully remote at all, hybrid hearing, and so I'm excited about that, and I will be in the hearing. We're meeting today to hear testimony on the benefits of the legacy pollution cleanup programs, which are included in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and many of them we have discussed previously on this committee. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Without objections, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Without objection, the member from Pennsylvania, Representative Cartwright, is authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearings. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted by electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. Again, as we said yesterday, and my colleague, Representative Huffman did, I too, and I'm sure others on the subcommittee, want to acknowledge the passing of our colleague, the Dean of the House and the former chair of the Natural Resources Committee, Don Young. My condolences go out to his family, his loved ones, and to his friends. On November 15th, President Biden signed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, a historic piece of legislation that will create jobs and invest over $1 trillion in U.S. infrastructure. In addition to building roads, bridges, ports, electric vehicles, and public transit, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law invests $16 billion into cleaning up two types of legacy fossil fuel pollution: orphan oil and gas wells, and abandoned coal mines. This subcommittee has spent considerable time in recent years discussing the history of these sites and the effects they have on the environment and the surrounding communities. We've also discussed policy solutions that are needed to prevent fossil fuel companies from walking away from their current drilling or mining operations, creating more of these hazards and saddling taxpayers with additional costs. As our hearings have broadly shown, fossil fuel extraction has a complicated legacy in the United States. Coal was the foundation of life in Appalachia, and that's been for centuries. And oil and gas production has generated wealth for states and communities and for the nation as a whole. Fossil fuels have powered the U.S. economy, increased our living standards, and have been critical to modern society. But they also came at a significant cost. Today, we're in a climate crisis, in large part because of fossil fuel pollution. And the continuous boom and bust cycle means that companies still find ways to abandon or walk away from their oil, gas, and coal sites without properly reclaiming the land and returning it to its original condition, leaving behind hollowed out economies, and scared and scarred landscapes. Over the country, there are over 100,000 orphan oil and gas wells. Let me say that again, 100,000 orphan oil and gas wells, hundreds of thousands of acres of abandoned mine lands, primarily coal, and thousands of miles of polluted wells. Orphan wells emit as much greenhouse gas as 1.5 million cars driven for a year, and that is probably an underestimate because we're not really sure of all the orphan wells that are out there. They are. These wells also contaminate groundwater, pose safety hazards, and undermine other land uses like ranching and outdoor recreation. Abandoned coal mines pollute drinking water and can destabilize the ground beneath homes, schools, and businesses. But this subcommittee has also heard about the many benefits of cleaning up these legacy pollution sites. We've heard about old mines being reclaimed and repurposed for solar fields and for wind farms. We've heard about rivers that once were running red with toxic runoff being cleaned up and becoming fishable and swimmable. And I do say I've learned fishable is a word. We've heard about former miners finding new careers in reclamation after the mines they've worked on have been shut down. And we've heard about how current oil and gas workers have the skills and experience necessary to cap and reclaim orphan wells. The investment we made in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law are set to create tens of thousands of good-paying jobs for these very workers. Average wages for this type of work can range between $50,000 and $100,000 per year. And thanks to the work of the Department of the Interior, we have already seen tremendous progress towards achieving our many goals for these cleanup programs. In January, the department announced that over $1 billion for plugging orphan wells will be available later this spring. And just this past February, the department announced that $725 million would be available for abandoned mine land cleanup. With these just already the first round of funding soon heading out the door, this is a chance to hear how this money will be used to restore clean air and clean water and create good-paying new jobs. We will also hear about how the communities can use this new federal funding to build sustainable, locally driven economic development. And while I want to emphasize how thrilled I am to see this historic investment, I also want to stress that stronger regulations at both the state and federal level are still needed to prevent more wells and mines from being orphaned and abandoned in the future. It should be the fossil fuel companies and not the American taxpayers who have to pay to clean up after they created the pollution. I look forward to continuing to work with the Biden administration as it implements the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and cleans up legacy pollution sites. With that, the chair now recognizes my good friend, Ranking Member Stauber, for an opening statement. Welcome, Representative Stauber.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. And before we begin the substance of the hearing today, I too would like to acknowledge the recent passing of our friend and the representative for all of Alaska, Don Young. I would also like, before my comments, make my comments, I would also like to thank Representative Huffman for his kind words on the floor Mr. Huffman, they were well appreciated and well respected. So thank you, my friend. I had the privilege of serving with the dean for only 3 years, which I understand to be a blink of an eye compared to his long and magnificent career, but it was a rewarding 3 years nonetheless. And for those 3 years, I was able to see firsthand and work alongside a leader whose subject matter expertise and relationship building will never be matched. Don served on the Transportation and Natural Resources, the two committees I sought and now serve on. He was a sportsman and a champion for the middle class, blue-collar workers. Don also was a pro-labor Republican like myself. He knew that supporting union men and women meant supporting high-wage, high-quality jobs in rural reaches like Alaska and northern Minnesota. My office and I constantly sought his opinion on everything from mining to education to infrastructure and so much more. Don's leadership and his humor had impact on this institution, which will be sorely missed. Thank you, Dean. And with that, to the topic at hand. We will today conduct oversight on the implementation of the administration's recently authorized Orphan Well program and additional abandoned mine land funding. The goal of these programs is to benefit the states. The administration's role is to be a funder and a partner to the states. Under this law, states are not just stakeholders. They will receive the funding they require from the federal government, who will, and I reiterate, act as a partner in administrating the program. Let's take the new Orphan Well program, for instance. This committee earlier this year considered legislation that would provide Orphan Well funding as a stick to states that didn't comply with its preferred philosophical outlook on oil and gas development. As we all saw coming, that bill is dying on the vine. Instead, the legislation that passed and actually became law affirms the rightful state authorities over their own Orphan Well programs. That means the Interior Department cannot force adoption of their extreme regulatory proposals in order for the states to receive the funding they're entitled to. And regarding the new AML funding, DOI has yet to issue any guidance on the application process. The funding was authorized on November 15th, right in the middle of Minnesota's whitetail deer season. It has been one full fiscal quarter since deer season, and states have yet to see any guidance on how to apply. Let's get this federal government working with the states on guidance so states can continue doing their good work to clean up AML. And before we hear from our panel of state and non-governmental witnesses, I'm pleased to be hearing from Deputy Assistant Secretary Felgus, who I understand has had a great career on this very subcommittee. It's been too long since the Interior Department appeared before us, and we would be remiss if we did not mention how this administration continues to push Americans across our great country. Candidate Biden made a promise to his most radical supporters on September 6th of 2019. The now president said at a New Hampshire campaign event, quote, "I want you to look into my eyes. I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuels," end quote. And at the beginning of his administration, he tried to fulfill that promise, canceling Keystone, shutting down ANWR, and this Interior Department has not issued any new leases, despite the requirements in the Mineral Leasing Act and in BOEM's 5-year plan. The results are catastrophic. Families struggle to afford to heat their homes this winter, and now gas prices are higher than ever. The summer driving season is coming up, and families are recalculating whether or not they can afford to go on vacation or join a Little League program where you may have to drive to games farther than you want. Approving a handful of permits after a 5-quarter delay in leasing won't immediately ramp up production. Operators need permits for rights of way, leases for multiple land parcels, permits to drill, air permits, water permits, and so much more. And this administration is now behind on 45 lease sales across 9 states over those 5 quarters. This administration got us into this mess. It started with Joe Biden pandering to the radical left, and now Republicans are fighting to get us out of this mess. I look forward to our hearing today to first ensure the new Orphan Well program and AML funding are correctly administered, and second, continually holding Joe Biden accountable for the things he has said and done to devastate our energy economy. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. I don't believe that Ranking Member Westerman wants to make an opening statement. So I'm glad now to welcome our first witness, Dr. Steve Felgus, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management at the U.S. Department of the Interior. As the Ranking Member pointed out, and I've worked very closely with him, Dr. Felgus is no stranger to us. Before his appointment at the Department of Interior, he was a longtime staffer for this very subcommittee. Steve, welcome back to the subcommittee. It's my pleasure to recognize you for 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lowenthal, Chair Grijalva, Ranking Member Stauber, members of the subcommittee. My name is Steve Felgus, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management at the Department of the Interior. And thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss the department's implementation of the legacy pollution cleanup programs in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. When President Biden signed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law on November 15th, 2021, he made a once-in-a-generation investment that will help local, state, and tribal communities across the nation rebuild America's critical infrastructure, tackle the climate crisis, and advance environmental justice while providing a solid foundation for economic revitalization and driving the creation of good-paying jobs. This tremendous achievement was only possible because Congress came together in a bipartisan fashion to support these critically needed investments, including these legacy pollution cleanup programs that we're discussing today. That support is not surprising when you consider the incredible opportunities that these programs will provide to eliminate long-standing polluted sites that have burdened communities, families, and our environment for decades, if not generations. Not only do we create good-paying, family-supporting jobs through the cleanup activities themselves, but we create opportunities to take what was once a burden for a community and turn it into a benefit. A dump for coal waste can turn into a solar farm or an office building. A graveyard for rusted drilling equipment can become a local park or a haven for wildlife. These blighted and dangerous sites become the nuclei of new economic opportunities, while at the same time providing healthier air, cleaner water, and a safer landscape. I've had the opportunity to travel with Secretary Haaland to coal communities in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and I've seen firsthand how this funding can be put to beneficial use. And the Secretary and I have talked to the local officials, the residents, and the workers who expressed their incredible excitement for what the funding in this law can do. To the people on the ground, sites that may have seemed impossible to tackle before don't seem quite so impossible anymore. That's why the department is so excited to be implementing this investment of roughly $16 billion from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law into cleaning up orphan wells and abandoned mines across the country. Now, orphan wells are a threat because they can contaminate groundwater, create public safety hazards in people's front yards, and emit methane and other gases that harm our climate and contribute to local air pollution, among other impacts. The department estimates there are tens of thousands of orphan wells on federal lands, and the states tell us they have counted roughly 130,000 on state and private lands as well. But as you mentioned, Chairman, the actual number is likely much higher. And because no responsible party can be found for these wells, states and the federal government have been forced to use their own limited funding sources to clean them up. But thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, there is now $4.7 billion to clean up orphan wells and associated facilities on federal, tribal, state, and private lands. The department is moving quickly, yet carefully, to make this money available. We've published the initial amount of formula grant money available to the states, and in close partnership with the states, are developing the guidance to ensure that this process is done transparently and consistently. We have also been conducting consultations with tribal nations and are continuing to meet with tribes as we work on starting up the tribal grant program. Now, while this is the first major federal funding available for orphan well sites, Abandoned coal mines have been getting remediated for nearly 45 years through the Abandoned Mine Reclamation, or AML, Fund, which was created by the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977. Coal miners pay fees into this fund, and then annual grants are made to states and tribes for them to carry out reclamation activities. To date, the AML Fund has directly resulted in the closure of more than 45,000 abandoned underground mine shafts and openings, the reclamation of more than 130,000 acres, and the restoration of more than 52,000 acres of clogged streams and polluted lands. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law builds on this success, authorizing $11.3 billion into the AML Fund. And on February 7th, the department announced the first allocation of $725 million to 22 states and the Navajo Nation. Like abandoned coal mines, abandoned hard rock mines also pose serious safety hazards while causing ongoing water pollution and other environmental damage. Many of these old hard rock mines are also in rural communities that have suffered from years of disinvestment. And there are hundreds of thousands of hard rock AML sites across the nation, although the exact number of these is also unknown. So we look forward to working with Congress in ways to address these legacy polluted sites as well, opening up more job creating and economic development opportunities while providing cleaner water and healthier landscapes for all Americans. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Felgus. And I'm now going to begin with the questioning. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. This question, Dr. Felgus, I'd like to know more about how the Department of Interior is coordinating with states, tribes, and stakeholders who will be instrumental in the success of both the AML and Orphan Welds program. What kind of coordination is happening on the ground? If you could just kind of help us. I think if that issue was raised by the ranking member, and I'd just like for you to explain to the committee a little bit more about what the actual kind of coordination that's occurring.
Sure thing. We have been working very closely with the states from the beginning of this program, and actually even before that. There have been discussions predating the signing of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law with the states to discuss the possibility of funding for orphaned oil and gas wells and other cleanup activities. So since the bill has been passed, we have had a number of meetings with the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission and also with the individual state oil and gas regulators, talking through the different issues that we've been working on as we stand this program up. And one of the reasons why we included a comment period on the draft guidance was to make sure that we continued to get additional feedback from the states, because they are the ones who need to implement this law on the ground. And it's very important to make sure that the guidance reflects the way that states can carry this out. We had given them a preview beforehand, and we'll continue to work with them as we move forward to make sure that we're working very closely, because we do recognize that the states are our partners in this effort.
Thank you, Dr. Felgus. I always look for scoops and kind of, you heard it here first. So I just want a quick answer to the next question. Dr. Felgus, the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement still does not have a permanent director. Is Interior actively looking for a qualified individual to fill that role? Can you give us any updates? And I promise I will not share this with anyone else.
Thank you. Thank you for offering to keep it private. I would love to be able to share some news on that front right now, but we are still in the process of searching for a OSMRE director. And I will say it's something that the administration is very focused on. That's a very high priority for us. So we're hoping to fill that position shortly.
Again, you can let us know. We will keep it under the hat.
I believe it. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Felgus, the draft initial orphan well grant guidance that the department recently released includes a number of recommended best practices for states. Can you identify some of these best practices and explain Interior's thinking and reasoning for including them in the draft guidance?
Absolutely. Thank you. And yes, we have included a whole list of best practices, because we think there are a lot of features that would go into sort of the ideal orphan well plugging program, and that runs from making sure that you are measuring methane emissions from wells before plugging and then after plugging, also making sure that the benefits are flowing to disadvantaged communities, that you are creating good paying jobs through these efforts. And we recognize that the legislation is written largely to allow states to use their own existing programs, especially through the initial grants, to start plugging these wells as quickly as possible. And that is a priority for us as well. We want to make sure that this funding starts flowing quickly and that we can create the jobs and start creating the on-the-ground benefits that the program is designed to create. However, we also understand that states are looking for a lot of guidance from the federal government for how to do some of these steps, like methane measurement, for example. So on the federal side, for the federal oil and gas plugging program, we are going to be very carefully measuring methane emissions from all of our orphan wells that we're about to plug, and then we'll measure them afterwards as well to ensure that that we know how much methane has been cut off and then that the plugging was done properly. We are trying to work with the states as closely as possible, providing technical assistance to make sure that they have the best methodologies to also do that themselves, should they choose to carry that out.
Thank you, and I'm going to yield back and now recognize the ranking member Stauber, for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Lowenthal, and I appreciate this opportunity. Dr. Felgus, thank you for joining us today. According to C-SPAN recordings, the White House press secretary said there are 9,000 unused leases on federal lands. 6 days later, the press secretary said there are 9,000 unused permits on federal lands. It's concerning to Congress and our constituents and industry that the White House does not seem to know the difference between a lease and a permit, although I am very confident you are well-versed from your time working on this subcommittee. So does this administration at least acknowledge that we must increase domestic production to address the energy crisis and lower gas prices for Americans?
Thank you, Ranking Member. The administration is very focused on trying to lower gas prices for Americans. It's something the president is extremely focused on and has been taking a number of steps to try and do so. So yes, I mean, that is a high priority for the administration.
So can you give us a 30-second version of the difference between a lease and a permit so the people can understand, because it's not clear from the White House?
Sure. Well, a lease is the initial sort of right to access the land that a company bids for, either onshore or offshore. And then a permit is the specific authorization to drill at a specific site.
Give us some examples of what's needed for the permitting to drill, could you?
I don't have the whole list of different information that companies must submit in order to get their permits to drill, but we certainly conduct a whole environmental analysis for any permit application and go through that very carefully before issuing permits.
And so the permit to drill isn't automatically given and it takes some time, correct?
Yes.
Okay. We've heard this line multiple times from this administration, and it makes clear there is a fundamental disconnect between DC bureaucrats and the reality of what actually happens on the ground and on the water. So if an operator, for example, has 2 permits in hand, but is waiting for BLM to approve rights of way to access a site, it amounts to a de facto ban because the operator can't begin. Bureaucrats stalling the process. And this is even before the company starts securing the materials and drilling rigs or trying to staff up a workforce in a rural area with an ongoing labor shortage. The point is, you cannot grind the leasing process to a halt like this president did on his very first day in office and then expect it to restart overnight. The price of gas is attributed to many factors, but our issues in America can be traced back to the first hours of President Biden's reign when he started this unlawful pause. And I want to close. Members of this committee 21 members of this committee sent Secretary Haaland on January 13th, 2022, a letter asking for answers on the administration's pause. It has been 59 days, no answer. Can you give us a response, and can you share with us in this committee the reason for this pause?
I will just say that there's no pause on leasing. We have been moving forward on leasing both onshore and offshore. There's been a number of conflicting court cases that have, thrown some wrenches in the works, but some of those court cases are being worked out right now. But we are moving forward, both onshore and offshore, towards leasing.
Dr. Felgus, are you telling us that there has been under this administration even one lease under this administration, not permit to drill, but lease?
Well, we did hold a major lease sale in November offshore. It's actually, I think, one of the largest in terms of acreage offshore lease sales that was ever held. Of course, that was subsequently vacated by a district court, but we did, hold that sale.
Did you challenge that district court?
The administration has not appealed, but the other parties to that lawsuit have appealed.
Why wouldn't the administration appeal the district court ruling?
I can't speak to that specifically. I will just say that that case is still under appeal. So that's still moving forward.
Dr. Felgus, who makes the ruling on the appeal? You?
Certainly not. No, I do not make these rulings.
And who makes that ruling on the appeal?
I would have to go back and check that for you. I'm not sure.
Do you have any input on it?
I have not had any input on this one. No.
Okay. So my question was, have you put forth, has this administration put one additional lease under this president, not offshore, onshore?
Onshore, we are working towards lease sales. And
Dr. Felgus, Dr. Felgus, with all due respect, that was not my question. Has the Biden administration put one additional onshore lease forward?
I would say we are continuing to work towards onshore leases.
That's a no. They haven't. And I think that with your working on the committee, the answer was an easy question. The Biden administration has not put one additional onshore lease forward. And I think it's somewhat disingenuous not to answer the question, especially with what's happening with the oil and gas prices that are devastating middle-class families. And so with that being said, first off, I want to appreciate you and your expertise on the subcommittee. You're very well versed and really appreciate you being here today. And Mr. Chair, I'm over time. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now call upon the Chair of the Overall Committee, Chairman Grijalva, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lowenthal, and I appreciate the opportunity to grill this particular witness. The commentaries that are going on, the truth is, and I think that if we're going to be transparent about these decisions, the decisions being made by the administration and legislation that we deal with, it's transparent. We tell you what the intent of that is and the goal of those policies. Unlike the fossil fuel companies, they have a vested interest in keeping energy prices high, especially when they can falsely blame high prices on the Biden administration. And so, when you have 5 oil companies making $75 billion in profit last year, and ExxonMobil and Chevron respectively $8.9 and $5.1 billion in profits in just the last 3 months of 2021. So, and the money is not going into production or into additional drilling or anything. It's going back into their shareholders as a return, not any investment in the production that everybody talks about. So before we dive into a conspiracy theory about what the administration or trying to confront climate change are causing high oil prices, I think we need to look equally as intently on these companies who are getting rich in manipulating and speculating on the gas prices here in the United States and around the world. So, yeah, if there's a conspiracy, it's a lot broader than Mr. Felgus and the Department of Interior. Trust me. Mr. Felgus, I asked the staff to give me really pointed and barbed questions for you to give to you. I received almost 150 questions. I won't have time for that. But one of the things, criteria, the state's rights and that they have prerogatives in terms of how they want to deal with the abandoned and orphan wells resources that they're receiving. And that would include my state as well. Public health and proximity to communities. Iija, frontline, tribal, indigenous, rural, that proximity and public health, is that a criteria that's being urged for states to look at, where the greatest need is and where the greatest exposure is?
Yes, absolutely, Chair Grijalva. And on the federal orphaned oil and gas well program, that is one of the key factors that we use in terms of prioritizing wells, and that is the proximity to populations, to disadvantaged populations, to environmental justice communities. So that's something that we take very much into account when we're looking at which wells we want to plug on the federal side. And we are encouraging that for states to do as well. And we think that most states also have their own prioritization programs that will often prioritize proximity to populations when it comes to which ones they want to plug.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you mentioning hard rock mining, especially out here in the West. The cost is unbearable to state or local or county governments, and that continues to be a huge environmental, safety, and public health threat out, and I see that as the next complement going forward. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to remind members on both sides of the aisle that the title of this hearing is The Benefits of the Legacy Pollution Cleanup Programs in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And that these issues that have been raised are, while very important, would have been addressed or should have been addressed next week in the hearing that we were going to have about production, except that the oil company CEOs refused to attend this hearing, so that we are not, that hearing next week, so that we're not able to ask those questions. Again, so I'm now going to call on Representative Graves for 5 minutes of questions.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. So I want to reiterate the title of this hearing is Benefits of Legacy Pollution Cleanup Programs in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which exactly none of our constituents have ever asked us to conduct oversight on, because nobody cares, because what is on front and center on the minds of Americans right now are the unaffordable cost of energy. Mr. Chairman, what the appropriate thing to do for this committee is for this committee to exercise its oversight authority over the energy policies that have caused the energy crisis that we're experiencing today, where the administration is talking about releasing 1 million barrels of oil a day from the energy reserves, which correctly are established to address energy emergencies, but not those that are self-imposed as a result of flawed energy strategies. This committee has jurisdiction over energy production. What we should be doing is we should have the Secretary of Interior, we should have the Secretary of Energy, we should have other officials before us answering these questions. And Dr. Felgus, I have a lot of respect for you, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to work with you for many years, but unfortunately you've been offered as a sacrificial lamb today. And I think that's really unfortunate that you're being thrown out there in this setting rather than actually doing what we should be doing. I said this earlier this week, I'm going to say it again. Just imagine for half a second if this was going on during the Trump administration and what the majority in this Congress would be doing, who they would drag kicking and screaming before this committee. I just heard the chairman talk about beating up companies for making profits. I want to also remind you, Mr. Chairman, these are the same companies that have walked away from tens of billions of dollars in assets in Russia, entirely walking away from them because of their objection to what's happening in the ridiculous activities of Vladimir Putin. Dr. Felgus, I'm sorry that you're here, but thanks for being here. Great to see you again. Dr. Felgus, I really struggle with something. I've heard this narrative coming out of the administration about the 9,000 APDs, the permits, and how this demonstrates that the administration is doing everything they can to increase domestic production. The reality is, number one, the permits that have been issued aren't under this administration, and primarily under the previous administration. Number two, you have more active permits right now than we've ever had before. Number three, the truth is that this administration is sitting on 4,500 APDs right now and doing absolutely nothing to advance those. And as my friend Mr. Stauber just talked about, this is the only administration that has not advanced a lease sale. And of course, what that means to the average American is not opened up or offered any additional lands or waters in the United States for energy production. Could you please respond to this and tell me how in the world this makes any sense?
Well, I'll just say that we have approved over 4,000 APDs since January 20th of 2021. And the number of APDs pending right now is actually lower at the end of fiscal year 2021 than it was at the end of fiscal year 2020. So we are
say that last part again.
The number of permits pending at the end of fiscal year 2021 is lower than the number that were pending at the end of fiscal year 2020.
But wouldn't that be because the previous administration had gone through and approved all of the permits early on, and we had a significant increase in energy production?
I can't speak to why the numbers are, but it's about 4499 APDs pending at the end of fiscal year 2021.
On top of it, Mr. Felgus, you got this administration that's out there offering this social cost of carbon, shutting down projects or preventing them from even being able to get into the regulatory process. Because as you know, getting an APD doesn't mean that you can actually produce energy. That's a step in the process, but there's much more beyond that, correct?
Sure. Our role is to process the permits.
No, not my question. Not my question. If you get an APD, can you start drilling the next day?
That depends on, as far as I know, it depends on the individual situation. But I will say that the
okay. Let me hold on. So let me ask it another way. Is there any scenario where if an APD is given, you can go drill the next day? Any scenario?
Sorry, I can't answer that.
I can answer it. No, it is simply one step in the process. You have made the NEPA process and others absolutely impossible to proceed through at this point. And it was intentional by this administration. Mr. Felgus, last question for you, Dr. Felgus. 8% of Americans, 8% support asking foreign countries to produce energy to address our domestic needs. Why is it the administration supports 8% of Americans rather than 92%?
Well, I'll just say that federal oil production on lands and waters in 2021 set an all-time record. So production on federal lands is up, and while overall domestic production is a little bit below where it was in 2019, it is rising, and the Energy Information Administration projects will hit record domestic production in 2023. So the administration supports, increased domestic energy production,
which
all forms.
Which, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate. I'm going to submit information for the record that clarifies or corrects the statement of Dr. Felgus in regard to domestic energy production, and make note that this administration is the first administration in history to block or prevent lease sales to address our domestic energy needs, and to triple nearly the importation of Russian crude oil and being dependent upon them. Yield back.
The chair now recognizes if she's here, Representative McCollum for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I am here and I have been listening, and I want to redirect because I do believe oversight on the issue for which this hearing was asked for is important, because I do hear from people. And my first question is going to be from some of the tribes that I've been working with when I've been out visiting reservations and that. So Doctor, can you give us an update on establishing a tribal grant program within the Department of Interior? Does the Department of Interior have a good sense of how many orphan wells there are on tribal lands? I go out and, whether it's underground storage tanks, wells or whatever, they don't even have a good sense of where things have been identified sometimes on tribal land, because tribal nations will be able to benefit not only from health safety standards being adhered to and cleaned up, but also putting land back into reproductive use. Can you just briefly comment on where you're going on working with tribes?
Sure, thank you. Well, in January, we had formal consultation, multiple sessions of formal consultation with tribes across the country about the implementation of all the programs in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And then in February, we started doing individual discussions, listening sessions with oil and gas tribes that were more likely to have orphan wells on their lands. So we've been getting a lot of feedback. We've been talking to these tribes consistently, but I will say that no, we do not have a good sense of how many orphan wells there are on tribal land. There's been a lot of disinvestment in these areas, so we just haven't been able to get out there and find out exactly how many wells there are and where they are. So that's going to be, I think, the first part.
Thank you for that, because my family comes from the Dakota, Eastern Montana area on my mother's side. So I've watched these bust and booms happen, and things get abandoned and things just get lost and they become orphaned. And this has happened over a period of cycles of time. I believe it is important to understand why we need to know where these orphan wells are and the threat that they pose to health and safety for millions of Americans. So I'm going to give you a moment here to kind of come back, take us back to what the chair was getting us to focus on. How do orphan wells impact both surface and groundwater, which often directly or indirectly people know are part of their drinking water systems, and what the department is going to do to work with federal, state, and tribal grant programs on this, because drinking water is important, it's a source of life.
Absolutely, and thank you. And yes, when it comes to groundwater, what you've done with a well is you've created a potential conduit from some hydrocarbons, oil or natural gas in a certain formation, with a drinking water aquifer higher up. And if a well is built properly and then closed properly, there should be no way for those hydrocarbons to get into the groundwater. However, if it's not done properly, if these are particularly old wells, if the casing breaks down or if they're not plugged correctly, then you can get methane or other hydrocarbons getting into the drinking water supplies, which obviously is a significant concern. For groundwater, one of the big issues can be if there's any fluids leaking out of the top of the well, but also it can just be the well pad itself could be contaminated from brine spills or other oil spills or other hydrocarbons on the site. And then through just the soil contamination and rain, that is one way that some of those contaminants can get flushed into surface water systems, lakes, rivers, and so forth. So there's quite a bit of potential for contamination of water from these orphan wells if they're not addressed.
Well, I look forward to seeing the president's budget being on the Appropriations Committee for the Department of Interior to see what we could do to work together to address this. And I'll close with this. I'm not discounting how important it is. I come from the North Country to be warm at night, to have your lights on when it's dark outside. So energy is very, very important. We talk about all the stress and the wars fought over energy. Folks, the wars that our children are going to be looking at, the conflicts that they're going to be facing, and even the Department of Defense will admit this, is over water for agriculture and for human use. Thank you so much, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative McCollum. The chair now recognizes Representative Harrell for 5 minutes of question. Well,
thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Felgus. I am very interested and concerned, obviously, about the abandoned wells. Obviously, New Mexico is one of the biggest producers of oil and gas. But what I concern myself with is the money that's appropriated for the cleanup. How can we know that this money will be given to the right entities, the right people, those on the ground with the most experience, to ensure that the wells will be plugged, cleaned up as they're supposed to be. I mean, it feels like the money may get pushed into a pile and we won't know if those that are really the experts in the area will be the ones getting the funding.
Oh, sure. Thank you. And yes, I think it's a very high priority to make sure that we have trained, experienced plugging crews that are the ones doing this work. And so we are providing a number of recommended practices in the guidance to ask states to ensure that they are using properly trained crews, properly experienced ones as well. Much of this is going to go through the states, though. So it will be say, for example, the state of New Mexico that will do the direct contract.
They'll have the oversight. Okay. And I mean, just in general, I mean, this entire conversation, I feel as if this administration, I mean, if their goal was to raise, the price of gasoline, I cannot even imagine what they would be doing different because we are all paying for it. But I do have a question specifically, kind of going back to that vein that my colleague mentioned in terms of permits. Right now, we've seen where the courts have actually ruled that many of the leases in question are valid. Can you kind of tap back into that as to why the department still isn't really moving forward with these leases, with processing these permits, I mean?
Well, I certainly understand the frustration with the situation, given the number of court cases that we have and the number of leases that are being either demanded or vacated, and how that's affecting permits. I can't speak to the specific situation because there are quite a few cases, and affect different universes of leases and permits. But I certainly, this is one thing that we are obviously paying very close attention to and following, court decisions as they're handed down.
Okay. In your opinion, based on your experience, do you think energy independence should be America's #1 priority?
Well, I would say that we're going to need all sorts of energy sources. Oil and natural gas will continue to be a part of our energy mix for a long time to come. But at the same time, we are trying to build our renewable and other clean energy sources as well. So the administration and the president put a very high priority on production of domestic energy, and we'll continue to do so.
Okay. And again, the orphan wells are a big deal to me personally because of obviously the district I represent. Are you aware of, or do you know any drinking water, any of the aquifers that have been contaminated by any of the orphan wells? I mean, I understand the potential could be there, but are you aware of any that have actually been contaminated or polluted because of the abandoned wells?
I don't have that information with me right now, no.
Okay. And I hope that we continue as a committee these conversations, because I think we missed the mark on some of this. I mean, I went down to the Chevron plant in New Mexico just recently, and I don't think we talk about, the good that they're doing in terms of all our big producers in lowering the emissions, what we've done to lower mortality rates in children's lives around the globe. And for New Mexico, 40% of our state budget comes directly from the oil and gas industry. So I think when we're having these conversations, we have to be honest with ourselves, our constituents. The all of the above approach is correct, but we also know there's going to be a high demand continuing for energy. And we just can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I really appreciate your comments today. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to ask questions, and thank you for this hearing. And I yield back.
Thank you. I now call upon Representative Huffman for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, for your leadership on these issues and for holding this hearing. And I think it's important to appreciate the good words that have been said about the Dean of the House, our late friend Don Young. It's important to realize that this historic opportunity that we have to do good work to address orphaned and abandoned wells is because of a bipartisan infrastructure and resource protection law that all of the Democrats on this committee supported, and all of the Republicans on this committee except one opposed. That one vote in favor of the law was Don Young. And I know that he often lamented the fact that too many people come to Congress and check all of their common sense and pragmatism at the door and just proceed to fight about things in grandstand. We are hearing speeches today that make that point better than anything I could say. And I have to say, I've heard a lot of these speeches, but we may be, scratching the bottom of the barrel with the claim by my colleague from Louisiana that U.S. fossil fuel companies somehow are voluntarily walking away from billions of dollars of assets in Russia, as if they woke up and suddenly had a bout of guilty conscience or ethics or something like that. Give me a break. They've had a bromance, a very lucrative bromance with Vladimir Putin for many, many years. And they sat by while he committed atrocities in Grozny and Aleppo, Georgia, while he seized Crimea. The only thing that has come between them and their lucrative bromance with Vladimir Putin is American law and our sanctions and the fact that the world community will no longer give them social license to do this. So let's just be real. The fossil fuel industry got us into this mess. They fought the transition to clean energy, which would have changed the paradigm. They fought it tooth and nail at every step. They enriched and empowered Vladimir Putin. Why should we turn to them for the solution to this problem? Because we know their solution is always the same. Do whatever makes us richer. We're already the world's largest producer of both oil and gas, but it is never enough. And so they are telling us that we've got to just double and triple and quadruple down on this same losing strategy. How many rides on this fossil fuel roller coaster do our Republican friends need to realize that it's always going to be boom and bust? There's always going to be the next war, the next disaster, the next accident, the next gaming of the global market by cartels and oligarchs. There is a better way. And this moment is an opportunity to proceed finally toward a clean energy transition that will make Vladimir Putin poor and powerless, and we'll probably see a new leader in Russia. Last thing I will just say on this, and by the way, I really wanted to talk about the subject at hand, but I feel like something needs to be said in response to all of this pandering and parroting of oil industry talking points. But look, outside of the Kremlin itself, there has never been a greater collection of Putin fanboys than the Trump administration. And all of our Republican colleagues, with rare exception, were just fine with that for 4 years. They thought it was making America great again. So give me a break. Now, Dr. Felgus, we know that orphaned wells are one of the top 10 polluters of methane in this country. There are over 5,000 estimated orphan wells in the state of California. So this is a big deal. We should be talking about this. Could you please tell me how Interior is working to ensure that plugging these orphaned wells genuinely reduces emissions of methane and other air pollutants, as well as groundwater contamination?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. Part of that is making sure you have good measurements beforehand so you know how much methane is being emitted from these wells, but then also going back to those wells after they've been plugged and making sure they're no longer emitting. And what we're doing as part of the federal orphan well program is we're putting together some methodologies that we are going to be using ourselves, but then also publishing for the states so they know what we consider to be the best practices to ensure that you're measuring methane correctly and accurately, both before and afterwards.
Terrific. And are you working on standardized metrics for measuring methane pollution? Because that's obviously a critical tool.
Yeah, that's going to be part of our methodology is what we would recommend that the states use. We can't force them to use these methodologies, but we will be using them ourselves in the federal program.
All right. Thanks very much, Dr. Felgus. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Huffman. Chair now recognizes Representative Tiffany for 5 minutes of voice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Felgus, how do this issue came up months ago in regards to undocumented wells? How do undocumented wells fit into this whole issue with orphan wells?
Well, an undocumented well is just a orphan well that hasn't been found yet. So we estimate there are likely hundreds of thousands of undocumented wells out there right now on federal land and state and private land. And we are just, as this program stands up, more of these undocumented wells are going to be found, and that gives us an opportunity.
And so you make a real effort as a department to try to find those undocumented wells. Is that right?
Yes, and we're working with the Department of Energy on that as well.
Terrific. Why is it more important to plug wells than drill new wells?
I don't think there's I think that's two different issues. I think we're very interested in plugging wells to make sure that we address the environmental consequences of orphan wells, both for contaminated groundwater, surface water, methane emissions.
So my colleague, Representative Stauber, in previous questioning, he asked why you didn't appeal that denial. The Biden administration has not appealed it. It appears by their inaction that they're showing that it's more important to go after plugging wells than opening new wells. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, don't you judge people by their actions?
I can't speak to the appeal. I can just say that we have been directed by Congress to start this program, and we're very excited to be moving forward to spending this money in partnership with the states to closing these wells and remediating these abandoned coal mines.
A couple things that you have in the first paragraph of your testimony. You said creation of good paying jobs. What do I tell the person in my district who showed up at a listening session and said, I got 200 people out of work now as a result of the shutting down of pipelines, including Keystone, not just Keystone, but Keystone being the kind of the headliner for all the pipelines that are running into headwinds?
Well, I'll just emphasize that the plugging of these wells and the remediation of these abandoned coal mines are going to create a tremendous number of very good paying, family supporting jobs. And we're very excited. We're working with the Department of Labor as well on ways to ensure that we have enough people out there who are trained and qualified to do this work.
And you cite their resilience to climate change. Do you believe climate change, is that settled science or is it a thesis?
I believe the science is settled in climate change.
So there's no question that 30, 50 years from now, we will see significantly rising temperatures as a result of man-made activity.
I would say we're seeing those right now, actually.
I just read a book review this morning by Stephen Koonin. Are you familiar with him? He worked in the Obama administration.
I don't believe I am.
I would suggest his book to you. It's called Unsettled with a question mark. In other words, climate science is unsettled. I mean, I think about where I live in northern Wisconsin. 10,000 years ago, we had a mile thick sheet of ice. And if the climate had not changed, we would not be living there currently. I think it's very clear that this is not settled, that man is causing climate change. We know that there's climate change happening, but whether man is doing that, and we have built this whole rationale for changing public policy here in America on this thesis that climate change, man-made climate change, is driving this. I would just close by saying this. Think about it. We have a department in the Biden administration that's more focused on finding undocumented wells than undocumented illegal immigrants. Think about it. We hear about profits for oil companies. Who's the greatest profiteer of the action taken on January 20th of 2021 that made it very clear that the Biden administration was going to be completely hostile, as candidate Biden said in 2020, to the fossil fuel industry? Vladimir Putin went from $60 a barrel to $100 a barrel. It was that day on January 20th of 2021 that he was emboldened. And we see what's happening now. His war machine is being funded as a result of America no longer being energy independent. And this whole notion that this is a high priority, I mean, we heard the same thing in regards to the border, that, oh, this is a top issue, and the president repeats these lines when he gives, for example, the State of the Union. But that's not what's happening here. It's all lip service, and the American people see through it. You need to refocus at the Department of Interior, as well as the Biden administration in its entirety. The American people are sick of paying $4 a gallon for gasoline. They're sick of paying $2.50 a gallon for propane to heat their homes. While my colleague from Minnesota can dismiss heating our homes as being important, where I come from, pretty damn important at this time of year, including into April when we have temperatures that are getting down close to zero yet. You guys need to refocus, and you need to listen to the American people. They want affordable energy. That's the only way we reach prosperity. It is all about job security, economic security, and national security
Mr.
by
Chairman,
having affordable energy. I
Yes,
yield back.
Chairman,
I
Mr.
yield
Chairman,
back to the chairman.
could we yield more time to Mr. Tiffany for this full-throated climate denial? This is outstanding. And I think the American people need to hear this unvarnished rejection of science and climate denial. It's priceless. And I would support yielding him even more time.
I would take,
Thank you.
I'd be happy to take more time, Mr. Chairman.
No, Mr. Tiffany has taken up more time.
Oh, the lead lawyer for the NRDC is offering me more
Thank you.
time? Come on.
Thank you, Representative Tiffany. The chair now recognizes Representative Dingell for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Stauber for convening today's hearing, which is really important legislation, the $16 billion in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Package, which was going to fund much needed efforts to clean up abandoned mines, plug orphan oil and gas wells, and other clean activities to protect public health and the environment. But first, I got to say 2 things. One, I miss my friend Don Young. My other colleagues have talked about him. Don Young was one of my dearest friends in this committee, has a huge hole. He's been part of the heart and soul. His spirit is there, whichever side he was on, he told it as it was. And 2, I have to join my colleague in just, we are in times. I'd like you to come to Michigan, which borders your state, which had unbelievable floods last year. I too experienced snow last weekend. It ruined my weekend on a number of planned activities. But we find that renewable resources are working, are less expensive, and would lessen our dependence on foreign oil to boot. And the fact of the matter is that we're all worried about what our constituents are paying at the gas pump, what they're paying to heat their homes, and we want to make sure that they've got a steady supply that isn't dependent upon global politics or can be used as a weapon. And I hope we keep moving towards protecting our climate and protecting consumers at the same time. So make that point. And in my industry, by the way, instead of everybody just taking cheap shots, we have the environmentalists, the auto industry, and the workers working together to help figure out what's the right thing. And if we could do more coming together at the table and figuring out what was right for everybody, instead of talking points that just take shots and accomplish nothing, we'd be better off as a country. Having said that, Dr. Felgus, it's good to see you back. Your enthusiasm and knowledge has been missed by the committee, and we're glad you're back here today to lend your expertise and your knowledge. While Michigan may not be a traditional oil producing state, there are dozens of documented orphan wells in and around just my district alone and have been identified by the state of Michigan's orphan well program. However, prior to the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Michigan's orphan well program only averaged between 5 and 10 well plugins per year, including just 2 in 2020. Dr. Felgus, can you talk about the public health impacts of orphan wells and how the funding in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will accelerate remediation of these wells, both in Michigan and across the country?
Sure. Thank you very much, Congresswoman. And I think you put your finger exactly on what's been a problem for so long with these orphan wells is that states simply don't have enough funding to address them. So what you have are wells that are leaking methane, can be leaking other hydrocarbons, benzene, toluene, other hazardous chemicals into the air. A lot of times they're located near homes, near schools, and that is a huge public health issue. In addition to the water contamination problems that can arise if you have methane or other hydrocarbons entering the groundwater. And there's also a public safety problem. There have been quite a few explosions actually from unknown, unplugged orphaned oil and gas wells leaking methane into people's homes. The concentration of methane gets so high, and then a spark can set that off. So there are quite a few dangers to this, and that's why we're so excited about this money that's going to go to the states to allow them to orders of magnitude higher in terms of the number of wells that they're able to plug each year, and also the number of people they're able to put to work plugging these wells. So we think it's a win across the board.
So thank you. And I think it's important to also note that these orphan wells are a significant contributor to the climate crisis and are the 10th largest anthropogenic source of climate deadly methane emissions, which you briefly mentioned. I have more questions, but I'm going to go back. I'm going to do one more because I'm almost out of time, but I worry about people losing their jobs, but it isn't either or. It's important to note that these plugging abandoned wells can create good paying jobs, and the average wages for this type of work ranges between 50,000 and 100,000. Dr. Felgus, can you describe how these programs specifically benefit the economies of rural and underserved areas?
Absolutely, and thank you, Congresswoman. As I mentioned in my statement, it is first the direct job creating benefits of closing these wells. It takes trained crews out there to actually plug these properly and then to remediate the sites. And then once you have plugged those wells or cleaned up those mines, you have areas that can be reused. The land is now available for other economic development opportunities. It can be also conserved if that's what the community is more interested in. But you take something that might have had some old oil and gas equipment that was blocking potential development, and you turn it into something where you can build a building or a recreation field or something else. So it's a win on both sides of that.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Dingell. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for the full committee, Representative Westerman. 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, and thank you the witness today. And Mr. Chairman, we're getting close. You know, we had a hearing a while back, and we said then the most pressing issue for American national security and for the American public is to talk about this energy crisis that we've got and to come up with solutions on it. And you know, at least we're not talking about NFL concussions or JEDI and environmental policy and some of those heart-wrenching subjects we've covered in the past, but we've got a nexus to energy today. I think we're at least in the parking lot of the ball game. Hopefully someday we'll get out on the field and actually address the real issues that are need to be addressed to the American public. But you know, it amazes me the false narratives that come out of the administration. The one about the permits, that was a pretty good try. You know, there's a lot more under the surface than what they try to put out in a headline statement or put out in a meme and try to fool the American public that all these leases are out there and it's the oil company's fault that we're not developing energy. I think that's been disproven pretty easily by my colleagues on the committee today. And, you know, we see other narratives being put out. I like the one about record oil production and gas production in the U.S. last year. And Dr. Felgus, I just want to, for the record, you did say that the United States produced more energy last year than is it ever or in the previous 10 years? What's your statistic there?
On federal lands and waters, there was more oil production last year than at least going back to 2003. I believe it's an all-time record.
So your testimony is that the Biden administration has produced more energy off of federal lands than the Trump administration, any administrations back to 2003.
That's correct.
I hope Mr. Huffman notes that under Democrat leadership that promised to stop production on federal lands, the administration is now taking credit for being the top energy producer on federal lands since 2003. I don't know how the base that's been pushing so hard against production on federal lands would feel about that, but it's amazing that that's being touted. So is that the result of policies from the Biden administration?
Well, there's going to be a lot of factors that go into that. I'm just reporting the data. The production from 2021 is the highest on federal lands and waters. That is, and we are continuing to process permits, and we've approved over 4,000 of those as well.
So you weren't insinuating anything that it was the Biden administration's efforts that caused us to produce more oil and gas. It's just the fact that we produce more oil and gas.
Yeah, I'm just stating the facts, but certainly, domestic production is something that the president understands, is important, and we are continuing to process permits.
Yeah, so important that he put a moratorium on leases on onshore and offshore production, and this administration has approved zero. The one you did try to do in the Gulf, and we've already talked about this, it got held up in court, and the DOJ wouldn't even challenge it in court. So I don't think the American people are going to follow the narrative that under the Biden administration we've increased energy production or anything that the Biden administration has had to do. But I'm sure the Democrat base would probably find that interesting that now the administration is claiming that they're the top energy producers on federal lands under their policies. Let's talk about a 5-year offshore leasing plan that's going to expire in June 30th. What's the administration done to get a new leasing plan in place?
Well, we've been working on that. That was certainly affected by some of the recent court decisions, but the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management continues to work on moving forward towards the next step in the 5-year plan.
Yeah, that sounds like good bureaucratic speak. What's your odds that there's going to be a 5-year leasing plan in place after June 30th? Like 0 to none. It's not going to happen because you all aren't trying to make it happen. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman. The chair now calls upon Representative Cartwright for 5 minutes of questions. Representative Cartwright, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to be back in the NR hearing room, even if only virtually. I want to share Congresswoman Dingell's sentiment. I also miss Congressman Don Young. I miss his great sense of humor, his great goodwill, a man who actually co-sponsored a lot of my bills. And I miss the man, and may God rest his soul. I want to talk about acid mine drainage. There are things that people care about other than what the local gas is costing at this moment, and there are things that people care about on a long-standing basis. When water and oxygen combine with pyrite from abandoned coal mines, streams and rivers run orange with acid drainage that extinguishes biodiversity, destroys ecosystems. You end up with waterways devoid of fish and insects that no one wants to live or work near. Pennsylvania has over 5,000 miles of water polluted with acid mine drainage. And we know how to fix the problem, but it's expensive. Passive treatment systems that neutralize AMD, fill up, and have to have the iron dredged out of them. And active systems that operate like wastewater treatment plants have their own operation and maintenance costs. The Iija, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, wildly popular and for a time bipartisan until 200 Republicans voted against it. It provided $11.3 billion to address abandoned mine lands. But here's the problem. It doesn't permit funds to be set aside for ongoing acid mine drainage treatment maintenance. And my bill amends the Iija to allow up to 30% of a grant to be reserved for the expenses of operating and maintaining acid drainage treatment systems. This change would restore the beauty of nature, reopen waterways to outdoor activities, and allow for new development and jobs. I appreciate this subcommittee's interest in making the change, and I look forward to working with the members to advance this important legislation. And Dr. Felgus, nice to see your face again as well. The Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement has determined that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funds cannot be used for acid mine drainage set-aside accounts. And can you explain to us why a legislative fix is necessary?
Sure thing. Thank you, Congressman. Good to see you again as well. And of course, the secretary and myself were in your district and saw one of these active treatment sites for AMD and the tremendous work it was doing, just having all of this iron fall out of the wastewater that was flowing out of the side of the hill coming from one of these abandoned mine sites. So we understand the importance of this and how crucial this funding is going to be to addressing those problems. And this is simply the way the legislation was drafted. On one hand, there is a little more flexibility provided to states to use some of the funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for acid mine drainage. They can use that directly on sites, whether or not they're associated with a higher priority site, something they could not do with their traditional money. But you are correct, the way the law is written, they cannot put any of their money in a set aside. So there would need to be a legislative fix in order to allow states to put their money into a set aside account.
Well, thank you for mentioning the kind visit that you and Secretary Holland made to northeastern Pennsylvania. You visited abandoned coal mine sites also in Ohio and West Virginia and Pennsylvania, including my district, seeing firsthand the acid mine drainage and the abandoned mine land cleanup that we have going on. Can you tell us why the new extra IIJA funds were so necessary for coal country, and can we count on them to boost economic development?
No, sure thing. The backlog inventory of abandoned coal mine sites that needs to be reclaimed, the cost was roughly $12 billion, somewhere between 11 and $12 billion. And that was not going down significantly over time because even though sites were being cleaned up, inflation was causing costs to increase, new sites were being discovered, emergencies were coming up that had to be dealt with. And because the traditional fee-based grants are funded by a fee per ton of coal that's mined, as the amount of coal mined goes down, as it has been over the past 10 years, the amount of money states are getting through their traditional AML grants has been going down. So it was sort of a situation where this need was still there, but states weren't getting as much money. In fact, the amount was declining over time. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law gives us an incredible opportunity to really address the overwhelming majority of sites that we know of right now. More will still be discovered, and inflation will continue to raise the costs on these cleanups. But this infusion of funds will make a tremendous difference to states by allowing them to go after some of these very large projects that they simply have not had the funds to do in the past.
Well, thank you for those answers, Dr. Felgus. Again, good to see you again, and thanks for all your good work. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Cartwright. That concludes all the witnesses and the first panel. Steve, I want to thank you for answering such a wide range of questions that gave you frequently, going far afield from the title of the legacy, pollution cleanup programs and the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But it was a very educational panel, and so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Now that concludes our first panel, and I'm now going to ask Steve, you're free to go if you wish, and now I'm going to introduce our second panel of witnesses. First witness is Ms. Rebecca Shelton, who is the Director of Policy and Organizing at the Appalachian Citizens Law Center. And then our second witness is someone I know very well, Mr. Uduak Jointuk, who is the State Oil and Gas Supervisor for the California Geologic Energy Management Division and a very active member of the Long Beach and who I'm pleased to call as a friend. Then we have Mr. Adam Peltz, who is the Senior Attorney for Energy Transition at the Environment Defense Fund. And our fourth witness is Mr. John Baza, who is the Director of the Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining. Let me remind the witnesses that going to remind the witnesses of something, that our committee rules is that they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record, and when you begin, the timer will begin, and it'll turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining, and I recommend that members and witnesses who are joining remotely, and that's everyone, will use the stage view so that they may pin the timer on their screen. And now I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. No, before we do the questions, I'm going to recognize the panel for each presentation, 5 minutes of presentation. Our first witness will be Ms. Shelton to testify. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Shelton.
Well, thank you, and good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Chair Grijalva, Ranking Member Stauber, and Ranking Member Westerman, and other members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the historic investment the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act makes into the Abandoned Mine Land, or AML, program. My name is Rebecca Shelton. I am the Director of Policy and Organizing for Appalachian Citizens Law Center, a public interest law firm and policy organization in Letcher County, Kentucky. Coal was mined in Letcher County for nearly 100 years before SMCRA's environmental safeguards and reclamation requirements were instituted. The landscape is dotted with dangerous mining features such as unstable slopes, high walls, and open mine portals. According to the federal AML inventory, it will cost over $21 million to remediate 104 AML sites in Letcher County. Across the entire state of Kentucky, the outstanding AML liability skyrockets to over $933 million. In spite of this tremendous need, the funds available for AML cleanup have been dwindling. 2011 to 2021 saw an approximate 60% decline in AML grants to states and tribes. As a result, while Kentucky's AML department gets hundreds of calls each year from residents reporting AML hazards, the state is only able to address those that it deems to be the most imminent threats. The story I include in my written testimony of a family who reported an AML but was only able to have the issue addressed after a landslide destroyed their home is an example of how the lack of adequate funding has had devastating consequences. The Iija funding changes everything. In the next 15 to 20 years, more funding will be spent on coal AML remediation than ever before. This investment will create much needed jobs for coal communities. Assuming a program duration of 15 years, economic analyses project that over 10,000 jobs will be created or supported year over year by the new AML funding in combination with the existing AML program. It is critical to focus on the development of that AML workforce. We will need new contractors to take on these projects. These contractors must have the expertise to complete high-quality work, foster safe job sites, and pay their workers well. The prevailing wage requirement in the law will support these outcomes, but that is not enough. We need other mechanisms to encourage the development of apprenticeship programs and require contractors to comply with responsible bidder criteria. I also want to address the issue of acid mine drainage, or AMD. AMD, shown in these images from West Virginia, disrupts aquatic ecosystems, undermines recreational potential, and can increase water treatment costs. Despite that, AMD is often classified as a low priority, meaning that remediation projects are rarely funded. Because AMD pollution is perpetual, remediation requires long-term funding streams. Under the existing AML program, states and tribes can set aside up to 30% of their AML allocations for such funding mechanisms. The Iija does not allow such set-asides. The bipartisan legislation introduced this week by Representatives Cartwright and McKinley, the STREAM Act, would allow these important long-term investments. Last, I want to make sure that we all recognize that this is a historic and celebrated level of investment, while also acknowledging that it isn't enough. The AML inventory of approximately $11.6 billion in unfunded projects does not account for inflation or the cost of project design, engineering, management, or administration. In addition, the current inventory is incomplete. Undocumented AML sites are identified and added to the inventory each year. Further, the Iija provides $25 million to improve and update the AML inventory. It is clear that the number of inventoried sites, that is, unfunded projects, and the cost of existing inventoried sites will increase, thus first increasing the overall projected cost of addressing AML in this country before it decreases. We have a tremendous opportunity before us to make our communities safer, healthier places to live, and to create thousands of good jobs while doing so. However, we must remain committed to ensuring these outcomes. It is critical to make funds available for long-term AMD treatment and ensure that the administrative infrastructure exists to diligently monitor program impacts and adapt to challenges. An important part of that administrative infrastructure is a director for OSMRE, a position that remains vacant in the Biden administration and for which we would like to see a nomination progress. This is a pivotal point for AML remediation, but we must all work together to achieve the economic and community benefits that have long been envisioned by organizations and residents across whole communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shelton. The chair now recognizes Supervisor Uduak, Joe and Took to testify. Supervisor, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the committee. Greetings from the West Coast, and happy to be virtually participating from Congressman Lowenthal's district this morning. We're grateful from California about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Iija. We think this is a once-in-a-generation environmental investment that's going to lead to thousands of new jobs, address long-term legacy issues of orphan wells, and help put people to work. The program in California looks to clean up, remediate thousands of orphan wells. We've identified more than 5,300, but we thank you for your leadership in driving this federal funding, because it's been a stimulus and a catalyst for us in the state. As California's State Oil and Gas Supervisor, I lead the California Geologic Energy Management Division, CalGEM. It's the state's oil, gas, and geothermal regulatory agency. Under Governor Newsom's leadership, CalGEM prioritizes public health, safety, and the environment, and our oversight of the oil, natural gas, and geothermal industries, while helping to advance the state's clean energy goals and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To fulfill these priorities, CalGEM has been the lead agency on orphan wells in California, in particular to help protect our most vulnerable communities. Oil wells and associated facilities that are orphaned and abandoned, deserted, pose significant risks to the environment and public health. Primarily, their unmanaged status can lead to many hazards. Orphan wells many times are long-term idle wells, or were formerly long-term idle wells. Those are not being used for production injection and have not been plugged. In California, we determined this is some well that does not have a viable operator or responsible operator, or has become insolvent many times through bankruptcy. Such wells may leak oil, injection fluids, formation water into surface and underground sources of drinking water. Runoff also releases toxic and flammable gases such as methane, hydrogen sulfide, volatile organic compounds that can have climate damaging results. The methane emissions can be significant, as it's a super pollutant. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency estimated that 7 million metric tons of methane gas are emitted from abandoned oil wells across the country in 2018. When orphan wells have no responsible operator to manage them, the responsibility typically falls to the state to permanently seal and close wells and remediate the site. Additional orphan wells can pose hazards, physical hazards, but people and animals, potential falling into well cellars or well casing, lack of adequate capping or gating, open staircases or tanks can often be rusted and corroded and unstable. Deserted and unsealed storage tanks can be open troughs and sometimes used for improper ways. Deserted production facilities could be magnets for vandals who occasionally deface and further damage deteriorating wells and facilities. This can create urban blight and eyesores as well. One of the unique situations, California, we're so diverse, we have orphan wells both in urban and rural areas. One example share, or two examples share, and in rural San Luis Obispo County, residents raised concern about a well that was covered in rubber tires adjacent to a playground. Our staff was able to go out and investigate, find a former responsible operator and get the well plugged and permanently sealed. Another instance in urban Los Angeles, in the Echo Park neighborhood, near Dodger Stadium, there were 2 wells discovered in a residential yard. The residents initially complained of the smells, headaches that were coming from the toxic gases. We were able to go in and find and plug both wells, but it used the entire state funds for that year. At that time, we only had $1 million a year to plug and abandon orphan wells, and that it was raised to $3 million, and now recent legislation next year raises it to $5 million. While those funds are greatly welcome, it's still inadequate to address our full problem of orphan wells. We've currently identified 37,000 known idle wells in the state, which may become orphan wells in the future, but we've increased our bonding, increased new rules, and have actually collected record levels of bonding this year, and the largest bond in California history of $60 million from one entity to make sure that we have the financial resources to cover future orphan wells from current operators. But the funds from the federal program will help us where there is no responsible operator. And we have had oil and gas operations occurring in California for more than 150 years. And so some of these very old legacy wells will be able to be addressed with this funding. I do have the remainder of my testimony submitted, and welcome questions. And again, appreciate the opportunity to speak before the committee today.
Thank you, Supervisor. The chair now recognizes Mr. Peltz to testify.
Chair Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the new Orphan Oil and Gas Well Closure Funding, an important component of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. My name is Adam Peltz, and I am a senior attorney at the Environmental Defense Fund, where I've worked on the local environmental impacts of oil and gas development for the past 10 years. I am also the chair of the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission's Energy Resources Research and Technology Committee, and have worked for many years with my co-panelists Uduak Joan Tuck and John Baza in IOGCC proceedings. The Infrastructure Act provides $4.7 billion to states, federal land management agencies to plug, remediate, reclaim many tens of thousands of orphan oil and gas wells, protecting the environment and public health while supporting thousands of jobs across the country. Can we put the map up? Great. This work will have meaningful impact in the communities where the wells are located, along with the climate at large. Orphan wells can leak methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, and are a safety hazard when located near structures. They can also leak fluids that threaten land and water and can emit air toxics like benzene and hydrogen sulfide, which bring health risks. These wells also reduce local economic development and lower property values, and can frustrate other subsurface uses like carbon dioxide storage and even hydraulic fracturing. And you could see that these wells, this is a map of 80,000 documented orphan wells, are located across the country in 28 states, in rural, suburban, and urban communities. They're everywhere. We could put the map away. Overall, the Orphan Well Closure Program appears to be on track for success for the climate, public health, and the economy. I have a few recommendations to ensure the efficient and effective implementation of this funding and to diminish the impact of future orphan wells. First, DOI partners and stakeholders have been working quickly to finalize guidance for states to apply for the initial grant funding opportunity. States seeking up to $25 million intended to fast-track plugging projects and show meaningful success this year have a statutory deadline of May 13th to apply for the funding. The guidance document leaves open many technical questions worthy of further discussion and clarification. We urge DOI to work this year with states, Department of Energy, tribes, and all their stakeholders to find mutually acceptable pathways to achieve program goals. Second, as states build oversight capacity and as industry retools, hires, and trains to accommodate this new workload, it is important for stakeholders to have certainty around the size and timing of funding availability. DOI has so far allocated 1/4 of the $2 billion formula grant. When the rest of the allocations are made, states and industry can begin planning on a multi-year time horizon, ensuring sufficient capacity to conduct and oversee the work and creating economies of scale. DOI should articulate what additional information is needed and by when to complete the allocations. Third, the Department of Energy has been tasked with helping to find, characterize, prioritize, and reduce environmental impacts from the large population of undocumented orphan wells, perhaps numbering 800,000 or more. When this work is complete, we will have a strong understanding of the true population of orphan wells and how to manage them. But given the scale of this work, DOE's $30 million allocation may not be enough to finish the job. We would like to encourage this committee to monitor the potential need for additional funding to complete this important work. Finally, and crucially, now is the time for all stakeholders to work together to make sure that today's currently active and idle wells do not become tomorrow's orphans. The existing inventory of orphan wells is likely many times larger than the IIJA funding can accommodate. States and federal land management agencies seeking new funding in the future will need to show that they were excellent stewards of the current funding and that they have made policy changes to ensure that all oil and gas wells are plugged in a timely fashion at the end of their useful lives with industry money. Historically, around half of the out-of-service wells drilled since the 1850s have been plugged, which means hundreds of thousands of currently active and idle wells are at serious risk of orphaning in the absence of policy change. There are many ways to address this problem, including updates to financial assurance, idle well management, well transfers, and orphan and idle well fees. Many states are taking steps in this direction already, including Arkansas, which several years ago adopted full cost financial assurance for marginal wells on transfer, and Colorado, which just adopted comprehensive well closure reform. There are incentives in the law for states that adopt reforms, reducing future orphan well burden, and now is the time to address this problem. Thank you all for your attention to this critically important matter.
Thank you, Mr. Peltz. The chair now recognizes Mr. Baza for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Baza.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the committee. My name is John Baza, Chief Administrator for the Oil and Gas Regulatory Program and the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Program, or AMR, within the Utah Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining. These are two of the division's 4 programs related to oil and gas, coal, and non-coal mineral development and reclamation in Utah. The oil and gas and AMR programs have established processes dating back 30 to 40 years to mitigate or eliminate the impacts of both orphan wells and abandoned mines left behind from historical development activity. With the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or BIL as I'll refer to it, Utah will benefit from federal funding to address existing liabilities in orphan well plugging and abandoned mine coal reclamation. However, Utah is not the best example of significant liabilities in either category. Our low orphan well counts and remaining abandoned coal mines are small compared to other states, and not by accident. Nevertheless, Utah appreciates the funding assistance from the BIL, and we will put that funding to good use. I'd like to give you some perspective on Utah's management of orphan wells and abandoned coal mines. First, speaking of orphan wells, as of last week, the total number of orphan wells on state and private land in Utah was 29. This number pales compared to other states whose orphan wells number in the thousands. As I previously stated, this low count in Utah was purposeful. The division has worked diligently to address the long-term liabilities of orphan wells. For example, in the early 1990s, Utah established a fund to plug orphan wells and reclaim well sites. The state also instituted an idle well management rule to identify current and future risks. As a result, Utah has kept the total number of orphan wells low by plugging existing liabilities and minimizing the number of wells that may default. In March, the U.S. Department of Interior issued a news release indicating Utah was eligible for approximately $30 million of federal grant funding for orphan well plugging. Utah can likely eliminate its current inventory of orphan wells within the first few years of receiving such funding. Although the availability of federal funding is favorable, There is concern about the fund's administration through the Department of Interior. It has taken considerable time for DOI to identify and communicate the grant application processes to the states. In addition, climate change, environmental justice, and union job creation are suggested for inclusion in grant guidance going beyond what has typically been implemented in achieving our orphan well plugging objectives. I question whether including such best practices are authorized by the BIL or even necessary to improve the performance of states having effective plugging programs for multiple decades. The BIL also extends the existing AMR fee collection and provides additional funding for eligible abandoned mine reclamation programs. The BIL AMR funds will provide approximately $5.8 million for Utah and be distributed if Utah can show an inventory of historic coal problems. Utah currently has a relatively low inventory compared to many other states with coal AMR programs due to efficient prioritization and completion of reclamation projects over many years. The Utah AMR program will update its inventory to include new problem types suitable for the funds. Even with the updated list, it is doubtful that Utah will need more than 5 years of funding at this rate. The BIL provides funding beneficial to Utah. However, more discussion and direction is necessary moving forward. Thank you for the time and attention you have allowed me today. I will answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Baza. We are now concluding the testimony of the witnesses, and we're going to return to the members of the committee for asking questions themselves. And I'm going to recognize first myself, 5 minutes of questions. And my questions go to all members of the panel. You really, from your own experiences, have added a lot to the issue. But I'd like to ask Ms. Shelton, Uduak, Mr. Peltz, Mr. Baza, that the following question. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, if you think other members of the panel, and I'll just go through and just, if you want to answer it, that's fine. If not, that's fine too. All of you. That in the coming months, communities across the country are soon going to see a huge influx of funds to clean up legacy pollution sites. This is more money than has ever gone out of the door in a single year to address these issues. But as we all know, money alone is not, I repeat that, is not enough. We're going to need skilled workers capable of completing these reclamation projects. So my question is, how are the states and communities that you are working with expanding workforce development so that they're ready to receive these federal cleanup funds? Are new training programs necessary to help grow this workforce? And what roles can the Interior Department play in establishing worker training programs? So each of you may or may not want to contribute, but you'll all have an opportunity. First, Ms. Shelton, is there anything you would like to add?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think, this is a really critical part of the effective implementation of the program. I think the first step is to educate existing contractors in our areas about this opportunity. Groups like mine and in my state, the agency itself is eager to help educate new contractors about the program and the bidding process for the AML work. Simultaneously, I think it's really important to understand what will be necessary to attract new contractors. We've learned that creating larger contracts will help attract contractors. Contracts to date in the areas have been relatively small, and because there's been such little funding for this work, we'll now have funds to tackle larger projects, which will help create some variety in terms of the project and the contractors interested in work. the last couple of things I want to add, there are legislation, there's a provision that allows states and tribes to aggregate sites and projects into a single contract. And I think that's really important that work, as not only because it ensures there are large contracts, because handling projects by geography and project type is also like to create economies of scale that are more cost effective. And last, as mentioned, I forget training for on such as apprenticeship program to learn the skills for this. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of workforce development.
Well, I thank you, Ms. Shelton. I have to comment, though, that at times your voice was not that clear for us. And so I just wanted to mention that, but thank you for your testimony and your answering the questions. Uduak, my question, the same question. What is California and the local communities in California? Are they ready to receive these federal cleanup funds? Are new training programs going to be necessary to help grow this workforce? And what role do you think Interior can play in establishing these worker training programs?
That's a great question. In California, this has been a catalyst. We've known this is a longstanding problem. The Governor Newsom has proposed an additional $200 million in one-time state funding to add to this, including an additional $16 million to create a pilot workforce training program. We've identified that this work should fall under unionized workforce and apprenticeship programs from the operating engineers and the laborers. But this would be a scale up. And so, programs like we're doing in California as far as workforce training, but also making sure that it's a requirement from the Department of Interior. In my recommendations, that we did recommend having prevailing wage, labor standards, local hire provisions, even project labor agreements as something that states should include when they're doing this work to make sure the public dollars go further to invest in communities. And we've also been doing outreach and workshops to make sure people know about it and encourage them to apply and participate in our program.
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to ask next, Mr. Pelt, in your experience at Environmental Defense Funds, what do you see in terms of training needs that are going to be needed, and how can Interior help?
Great. Well, the program is set to pay for the creation or retention of tens of thousands of oil field service jobs, and a ramp up is needed. And on top of what's in this program, over the next 30 years, we could be plugging 1.5 million wells. So there's a lot of work out there. There's a lot of people who are interested in doing this work. I know that the state of Louisiana passed a climate action plan that includes job training for orphan well plugging. And I think this is a great opportunity for the White House to partner with industry and states to figure out what are the needs here and be able to help everyone ramp up to meet them.
Thank you. I'm going to interrupt you because we don't have a lot of time left. And my final question is to Mr. Baza. You described in your testimony just what is going on in Utah, and that the scope of the issues, because Utah's been working on this for a while, is not as great as in some of the other states. Do you need in Utah to develop new training programs to grow the workforce, and what role can Interior play in establishing worker training programs, Mr. Baza?
Yes, absolutely. We do need help because there is labor shortage. I've experienced that even in our own state agency, trying to hire skilled workers into our inspection and enforcement positions. But I think what I can see is a necessary input of both funding and education at our higher educational institutions and our vocational schools in the communities that are affected. This is not something that has been ideally promoted to a great extent in terms of either orphan well or abandoned well plugging skills, but it's something that we can see that is necessary for all our disadvantaged communities in Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Baza. And that concludes my questions, and I now call upon Ranking Member Stauber for his questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair Lowenthal. Mr. Baza, as a state official in charge of oil, gas, and mining operations, you know better than anyone how to implement these programs. And I understand that the states working through the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission have provided feedback on guidance documents released by DOI. Has DOI adequately addressed these comments and or indicated a willingness to work closely with you?
My impression is that the willingness is there. They've had several conference calls with multiple states through the IOGCC. However, I think where the rubber meets the road, I haven't yet seen a lot of guidance coming directly, for example, to the state of Utah with the needs that we have, which are relatively small, or with our labor shortages that we're experiencing. So I would say that there's more outreach necessary.
Okay, so maybe at this point, the lip service needs to be put where the rubber meets the road. Would that be correct?
I agree with that, yes.
And as a state regulator, you are a leader on this issue and a partner by statute to the federal government. What recommendations would you have for DOI to ensure states are truly treated as partners in this process?
Well, I think I could speak not only for state governments, but even the tribal communities as they engage with discussions with DOI. They've got to do it on a very direct government to government basis. I know it is good to have these general meetings with multiple states on the IOGCC calls, but as I said, it would be great if people from DOI would directly reach out to our governor and our organizations here in Utah and coordinate with us on a one-to-one basis.
And the DOI hasn't reached out in that one-to-one capacity?
Not as yet.
Okay.
Not for Utah, at least.
Okay. And here's an easy one. Has the Department of the Interior held a single lease sale in the state of Utah since President Biden took office?
No, there haven't been any lease sales in the state for the last 2 years.
And how long does it take BLM to issue an application for a permit to drill on federal lands? And how long does it take the state of Utah to do so?
I was at a recent industry meeting here in the state, and we had a representative of the BLM who said that the national average for the BLM right now is about 180 days to issue a permit to drill. I looked at our statistics just recently, and for 2021, we were at about 70 days to issue a permit.
Okay, so the efficiency within the state of Utah in developing these permits is something that maybe the BLM can consider some of those efficiencies. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I also say that the 70 days is not a great statistic for us. We would like it to be a lot lower, but the complexity of what we've seen in horizontal drilling these days has greatly increased the length of time for permitting.
Yeah, and I think earlier you said something that the DOI working together with, you know, the states and what have you, and in particular Utah, as for this discussion, working one-on-one. I think the collaboration we can gather information to make the BLM even more efficient in their permitting. So, altogether, what do you think what's the reason that the delay is more than double? What do you think the reason is? And have you expressed an opinion to the DOI on speeding up the redundancy, speeding up the permitting?
Well, I think we're probably far more nimble than the federal government in terms of both addressing on-the-ground issues and assessing the impacts of drilling. I do know there's a whole lot of additional regulatory baggage that my BLM counterparts have to address. Things like NEPA or general environmental issues that we tend to do very quickly and in sort of an environmental assessment light process in the state of Utah. So that's one area where they expand their timeframes.
Great, thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. The Chair now calls upon the Ranking Member of the full committee, Ranking Member Westerman, for 5 minutes of questions. If you're here, I believe you may be out of the parking lot, as you pointed out in your last statement. I don't hear him. It's a large parking lot around the stadium. Now I call upon Representative Porter for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome, Representative Porter.
Orphaned wells leak methane and other toxic gas into the air, threatening the health of our communities. The Environmental Defense Fund calculated that approximately 9 million Americans live within 1 mile of a documented orphaned well. This does not account for the millions more Americans who live near orphaned wells that are undocumented. Mr. Peltz, is it possible that Americans are living near polluting wells and they don't even know it?
Thank you. I think that is most likely true. The 9 million Americans that we found living near within a mile of a documented well was based on a well count we did last fall of around 80,000 wells. The current count of documented orphan wells is around 130,000 wells, and the bulk of that infill is as a result of data cleanup on the state side. And lots more in Ohio and in other parts of Appalachia. 6,000 in Missouri are now on the list. And so, and that doesn't count the perhaps 800,000 undocumented orphan wells, which will more or less be in the same locations. I suspect a lot of people don't know that they live near these wells.
How does the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law address undocumented orphan wells?
Well, the law provides the Department of Energy with $30 million to help states, tribes, and federal land management agencies find, characterize, and prioritize undocumented orphan wells across the country. Many of these were drilled in a pre-regulatory era before, say, the 1900s, and there are very few records for them. The DOE can go out with drones, with magnetometers and LiDAR, or even send people out into forests to look around at what's on the ground. It's a great effort to help us really understand the total orphan well inventory in the US so we can take appropriate steps. And states are allowed to use their funding for this purpose as well.
Is $30 million enough funding for those labs to find all the wells and run tests to see that they need to be plugged?
Well, there are 5 national labs that are involved along with the with headquarters. And I love the national labs, but they spend money pretty quickly. I don't think $30 million is going to find 800,000 wells. And the states have additional technical needs that DOE can help with, like on methane emissions quantification and on beneficial uses for sites like conversion to wind or solar, or use as geothermal or carbon sequestration monitoring wells. For all of these functions, I think we should look closely to see if the Department of Energy could successfully use more money that would benefit public health, the environment, and the economy.
Thank you. I'm planning on submitting an appropriation request to try to provide the money that will be needed to actually locate these undocumented wells. We simply can't fix what we can't find. And Americans deserve to know if they are living next to one of these wells that's polluting their neighborhood by emitting toxic gases. Supervisor Intuk, can you talk more about undocumented orphan wells, specifically in California?
Yes, we, as part of this effort, identified 5,300 orphan deserted wells and facilities, but we know there's potentially up to 18,000 undocumented orphan wells. Part of the funds in the initial grant, we're planning to do a statewide assessment to be able to quantify the number more precisely, so that we'll have a modern estimation.
Great, thank you. In your testimony, you mentioned an orphan well that was once adjacent to a playground in San Luis Obispo County, and you said the well was not properly plugged in 1944. How can we ensure that wells are plugged properly the first time from here on out?
Well, similar to what we were saying before, the 150-year history of oil and gas development in California, our agency did not come into existence until 1915, and modern plug and abandonment standards didn't start till the 70s, and our current standards were last updated in 1991. So any abandonments happening now going forward will isolate the hydrocarbon zones, the base of fresh water, fill the well with cement, cut it off at the surface, so it can't be a hazard like the Beckett well was in San Luis Obispo, adjacent to a playground with only rubber tires around the top and open at the surface.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Porter. Have we found Mr. Westerman in the parking lot? Welcome to the committee, Mr. Westerman.
On the playing field here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Baza. I have, my feelings, my ideas and beliefs about the best way to regulate oil and gas and mining operations, and that's to let the states do that on leases within their borders. And I think that would even extend to the Orphan well and the AML programs that we're discussing here today. Mr. Baza, as you know, the Department of the Interior hasn't approved a single lease on sale in the state of Utah or any other state for that matter. And this is all lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. How does the impact of oil and gas development on state and private lands affect or impact the state of Utah?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think when we look at how business operates regionally, the capital investors for petroleum development are going to go to the place of least resistance or the best return. If, for example, with a large percentage of federal lands in Utah, we're not seeing competitive lease sales going on, then that's going to affect state and private lands because those capital dollars will flow elsewhere where they can develop and get a good return on their investment. So I think, we're going to be harmed in the long run if we don't see competitive lease sales occurring on the federal side, and the state and private lands will be injured in the process.
And I know, I'm not sure if this is true in Utah. I know it's true in a lot of places where you have kind of checkerboard patterns of ownership. And you might have some federal leases, you might have some private land, you may have some state land all next to each other. And these wells that go down vertical and then turn out horizontal for a few miles, they could cross several lease sales plus cross private land or state land. So how could you can you explain how you could have leases and even permits on some sections, but because you don't have the adjacent one, how that can cause you not to be able to develop?
That's correct. I know that some leases may be as small as 40 to 80 acres on a 2-mile lateral, which is what most of our horizontal wells are being drilled on. You can cross multiple lease types: state land, private land, federal land, and even tribal land. And if any one of those land types would hold up the process, then you've just missed out on the opportunity to drill that 2-mile horizontal well.
So it's pretty strategically easy to approve some leases and permits and then block out development because you don't have the surrounding leases and permits. And like you said, any one of these ownerships can get tied up for various reasons. You stated in your testimony that DOI has suggested to the states that they must modify their established plugging programs to include DOI best practices. I remember back to a lot of debate we had on blowout preventers in the Gulf, and the federal government wanted to not tell the producers, they didn't ask them what time it was. They were trying to tell them how to build the watch. And they had this kind of Rube Goldberg contraption that they were claiming was the best practice, best technology, which was totally unfeasible and probably wouldn't work had they done it. What do you think about the federal government's best practices compared to the state's best practices, or even to industry best practices who are out on the leading edge of innovation and technology?
Well, frankly, because we've had our program in place for the past 30 years in plugging orphan wells, I really do feel we already have best practices. And these are systems that are designed to be efficient with state money. Even though we would be looking at additional federal money, we would be no less efficient or effective in plugging wells. So I would prefer if the federal government would merely say, Utah, you've already got a great program. We're just going to make sure that fiduciarily we're managing the funds properly and let it go at that.
And what you've got works. So thank you for your testimony. I'm out of time and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman. I now call, I believe it's our last member, Representative Tiffany, for 5 minutes of questions.
Hey, since I'm the last one, can I have more than 5 minutes as was suggested in the last questioning, Mr. Chairman?
I did not give additional time, but I'm not going to count this against your time.
You're so kind, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Felds, in your testimony, it says scale up hiring for orphan wells. In other words, sounds like on the federal side, scale up more hiring. Do you think there should also be hiring scaled up for getting permits out?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not an expert at all in federal leasing and permitting, and I don't know what BLM's capacity is or isn't. But I do know that for the orphan well programs, as they grow, in some cases 40 times larger, like in Pennsylvania, the state needs more permitters there, and better data management systems, and contract procurement experts, and more inspectors to be able to go out in the field and make sure that that this work is done properly. But the vast majority of the jobs that will be created under this program will be in the private sector.
Does the Environmental Defense Fund take any money directly or indirectly from Russia or Chinese interests, in particular
Absolutely
their
not.
governments? Do you guys take any money from the Sea Grant Foundation?
I'm not sure. I'll have to check and then answer for the record.
That would be terrific. If you could find that out, that'd be great. Because it's been pretty much proven now that the Sea Grant Foundation is passing out money that's coming from foreign governments. Mr. Baza, thank you so much for being here today. And I want to extend the questioning that Ranking Member Westerman was talking about. I read one paragraph in here in your testimony. Additionally, specific initiatives are being suggested, including addressing climate change, environmental justice, and creating union jobs. Have you been given direction or guidance what that means at this point?
I believe that there is a draft guidance that's still being discussed.
Have you done, Mr. Baza, have you done an analysis at all on how much more that's going, how much more time and money it will cost you to go through those additional requirements?
No, I haven't, honestly, but I know it's got to take more time than what we're already spending in these wells.
Could it be the case that you may not want to take the money if it puts too onerous of requirements on the state of Utah?
Again, that's a great question. I did say that part of the process has been slow enough that we weren't able to go through our standard legislative appropriations process. It wouldn't surprise me if once we did, the legislature saw these strings attached and would say, no, we're not going to accept those federal funds, but that's a decision they would have to make.
Yeah, for sure. Might it be the case where you're going to, because of your successful program, ask for exceptions because of your exemplary record?
Where we can ask for those exemptions, we certainly will.
Yeah. Do you ever get issued exemptions? I mean, have you asked in the past for exemptions for things like this and been granted them?
You know, there hasn't been a lot of experience with us receiving federal grants of this type or this magnitude, We do have grants in our coal program and in our abandoned mines program that we utilize. And the federal government often provides us with exceptions or variances where there are exceptional circumstances.
So you cited NEPA earlier, and the NEPA process, whatever you call it in Utah, do you believe that that works?
Yes, again, we have a very light process compared to the federal government's NEPA analysis, but the objective is to do it quickly, expeditiously, and address those true impacts that drilling would have on the environment and surface.
Do you believe it's been effective?
Absolutely. I think we do a very good job at the state level, and there have been no major disasters, as far as I know, in terms of oil and gas drilling impacting the environment in Utah.
Well, when we get into revamping the NEPA process, we're going to bring you forward because we could really would welcome your expertise on how we can make the NEPA process so much better in this country rather than these 15 to 20-year waits. And have you heard frustration in regards to some of the requirements from the feds from your counterparts in other states?
Yes, absolutely. I've heard several comments being raised, for example, by state of North Dakota and the state of New Mexico in terms of what some of these additional requirements might be.
Yeah, well, I'm going to close here, Mr. Chairman. I've just closed with this. Once again, we heard some comments in regards to undocumented wells. I think it's great that this committee is concerned about undocumented wells. I just wish that this Congress was as concerned about undocumented illegal immigrants that are coming across our border in record numbers. It really seems that this Congress has its priorities misplaced. But I want to thank the witnesses, in particular, Mr. Baza. Continue the good work in the state of Utah. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Tiffany. And first, before we conclude this witness panel, are there any members that wish to ask questions that have not been called upon? Well, not hearing any, I just want to ask the panel, and let me preface it by saying one of the things that we have done on this subcommittee is when we have panelists coming in, is that we ask them at the conclusion of the hearing, was there any question you would have liked to have been asked that you think that you can add to the record? You don't have to do it. Lots of times panelists don't have any additional questions, but I would like to offer the opportunity to the panelists. Is there any question? And we'll start right from the first panelist, Ms. Shelton. Was there any question you would have liked to have been asked? I can't hear you. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you, Ms. Shelton.
Okay. I'd just like to emphasize that, we have talked a lot about about the economic impacts of these programs and cleaning the jobs that need to be created. And that I just want to bring it back, though, to the fact that, communities live with these hazards. And, there is a lot of conversation to be had about how best to address these hazards, what programs, but we just need to get it done. And I think the really important thing for us to do at this level of government, at the state level of government, local level of government, is to really focus on the goal of cleaning up these sites. And so I thank everyone for your commitment to that today, and hope that the goodwill towards that intention continues to protect communities all over this country.
Thank you. Supervisor Uduak Joe and Tuke, is there any question that you would have liked us to have asked that you could think you can add, that your response can add to the record?
Yeah, one question might have been good of what is California's experience with DOI? And if I could share, we've had a very positive relationship. We had the opportunity to host Secretary Holland in Los Angeles to visit urban oil and gas sites. They did come out to our business meeting meeting last year in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and gave a presentation of the program. We've had many virtual correspondence, individual direct correspondence. We have a meeting, we've met with the Bureau of Land Management here in California and provided wells and are coordinating on orphan wells on federal property here in California. And so just to add on that, that would have been a great question for us to be able to speak to as far as California's engagement with the Department of Interior on multiple levels.
Thank you. Mr. Peltz, is there any question you would have liked us to have asked, and how would you have responded to it?
Yeah, so on a question of how to reduce future orphan well burden, I should say that it is so exciting that this money is available for states to accelerate their orphan well plugging program. States have been plugging orphan wells for decades, and this money will help them vastly accelerate that process. But even so, there will still be a lot more orphan wells left to plug, which may require additional funding. Perhaps more to the point, we have a current inventory of maybe 1 million active oil and gas wells, and some fraction of those will be plugged on their own, half, maybe more than half, but a lot of them might not be under current policy. And so the question is, how can we work together, federal land management agencies, states, industry, other stakeholders, to figure out how to get to a place where all of these wells are plugged in a timely fashion at the end of their useful lives with private money? I think we can get there. I think a lot of states have already made really strong movements in this direction. In some states, this is not that big of a problem. In other states, it's a bigger problem, and it's a team up effort to figure out how to do it right. And there's bonus money in the law to reward states that make progress towards reducing future orphan well burden.
Thank you, Mr. Peltz. And finally, Mr. Baza, as the cleanup person, is there any question that you would have liked the committee to have asked you, and how would you have responded?
Well, as cleanup, hopefully I can hit it out of the park.
All right.
To add to Supervisor Entuck's statements, I mentioned in my testimony 29 orphan wells on state and private land. I know there are a number that exist on federal land in Utah as well, and the BLM has their funding pool that they can draw from on this. I think one question I would like to have addressed is how can we cooperate and maybe make our different pots of money go further by coordinating our activities in the state across state, private, and federal orphan well situations.
I want to thank all, first of all, thank you for that answer. I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the questions and answers that they provided at the end, and the members for their questions. Members of the